Okay, so this isn't your weekly YouTube. This is just a snippet from the Florida shooting that I want to bring to your attention. As I've mentioned in earlier announcements, what goes on in the outside world affects what happens in the classroom. And what I'm hoping that you get from this week as well as this course is that it gives you a lens to look at issues that come up relating to terrorism and relating to large scale violence that we've seen here. So I want to bring up a couple of issues that have come up. And again, we're still getting information on the Florida shooting, but things that I think are relevant for this course, this program. So defining terrorism, we go on and on about that. Is this terrorism? Is it not? Does he have a political narrative? Was he associated? And there's reports that he may or may not have been associated with right wing extremism. And when I say associated, we're talking about a very loose connection. But does that make it terrorism? Most people would say no. But I can guarantee you, if he had that same loose association with ISIS, people would say it's terrorism. So again, what is terrorism? What isn't? This issue brings this into clarity. When does radicalization deserve further scrutiny? This has come up with FBI tips, and it's come up with this case, FBI tips. It's come up in your case studies with the Fort Hood shooting, the Orlando shooting, the Boston Marathon attack. When does radicalization deserve further scrutiny? Specifically, what resources should be dedicated to a certain level of radical inclinations? And I'm saying this person is radicalized, and I'm using that term loosely here, but he showed certainly uncharacteristic behavior. Again, in this case, he's acting weird. Should there have been an investigation, a clear, open investigation based on the tips that were received? There was a YouTube message that was reported to the FBI that said, hey, I'm going to do a school shooting. That, combined with him acting weird, combined with the dozens of times the police went to his house, probably deserved more scrutiny than it got. So at what level does radicalization deserve scrutiny? If he had just done the YouTube thing, should there have been an FBI investigation? Should there have been surveillance? Should he have been detained? Should he have been forced to go under a forced psychiatric evaluation? That is something to think about that is very relevant to this week's lecture, is radicalization. And again, a lot of this is hindsight. Just like in the Fort Hood shooting, a lot of it was hindsight. The Boston Marathon, a lot of it was, well, we should have known at the time. But one thing to ask is, what's hindsight? What's Monday morning quarterbacking? What should have been a legitimate issue that should have been investigated? That is something that I don't think we quite have our hands on as a society. And certainly when you take it outside the associations with ISIS, associations with Al-Qaeda, it gets a little bit more murky. And we'll get into that in a second. So mental health always comes up when these incidents come up. Well, why don't we have mental health? We need better mental health issues, and you do need better mental health issues. We send far too many people to prison that have mental health issues. We don't have enough treatment and psychiatric help for people that need help. But the question will come up, okay, how does this guy get a gun, or how is this guy peeing on society? And the question comes up, do we have mental health watch lists? That is a scare, or I'll leave it up to you, but that could turn into a very scary thought. That you have a database with people who have been hospitalized, who have been maybe even receive antipsychotic drugs. Do we want to have that database? And do we want to have that database available so a guy who purchases a gun has to be cross-referenced against that database? That's essentially putting people's health records in an accessible database. And there are a lot of issues with that. And then the question is, okay, what type of mental health? You could just say he has a mental health problem. Okay, well, who would be put on such watch list? Someone who's been admitted to a psychiatric hospital, someone who has confessed to something in the privacy of a psychologist, someone who's taking antidepressants. Millions, tens of millions of Americans take antidepressants. Should they be put on some sort of mental health watch list and cross-checked against gun purchases? I don't know if that's something we as a society could ever come to grips with. And then I want to talk about gun control. Always an issue that comes up on these things. I'll give you again my personal. I think we do have a lot of guns in this world. I think. Well, let me back up. Mass shootings are only a small part of gun issues, and just like we talked about the first week of class, the chances of you being in a mass shooting is again probably the same as a lightning strike or vending machine accident or something like that. So the chances are small. They get publicized a lot, but the gun control issue is worthy of revisiting. But again, let's talk about what the trade-offs are. We're talking about stopping AR-15s and these mass shooting rifles, banning them, regulating them, whatever you want to do, to stop mass shooting incidents that may affect 0.001% of the population, or someone who's killed in a mass shooting. I'll let you decide, but this goes back to our first week discussion about, one, the chances of you being in a shooting are nil. However, is it worth regulating these assault weapons to do it? And then, as what a couple of you brought up, it's not necessarily that you'd be impacted by a mass shooting directly, but you're certainly indirectly impacted. If anyone has a kid who goes to school and they have to attend a active shooter training, that impacts a child. So just like we said, terrorism, you might not be killed by a terrorist or wounded, you are still impacted by a terrorist. So those are, again, those week one lessons are still relevant in this gun control debate. But then, the two issues that come up are, so can we cross-check, and legislation is out there, terrorists with mental health, and this goes back to my watch list issue about if someone has a mental health issue, their gun purchases get cross-checked. And then you get the second point, cross-checks with the Terrorism Watchlist. This is another issue that's been legislated, and there's 2 points to this that are relevant to law enforcement and counterterrorism. One, if you're on a no-fly list, and if you saw the underwear bomber, you know what a no-fly list is. If you're on a no-fly list, then you shouldn't be allowed to purchase a gun. That if a guy walks into a gun store and he does a background check, if he's on the no-fly list, he can't purchase a gun. So that's one point. What would be really helpful to law enforcement is if you flip that out. If someone pops hot on a terrorism watch list and you can backtrack that person's gun purchase history, that would help law enforcement and federal officials know, wow, he is, not only did he just pop up on a terrorism watch list, but he just purchased 15 AR-15s in the last year. That would be very helpful to law enforcement. However, that would require a national gun registry. I don't think that, well, maybe I could be wrong, but I don't think politically that is a viable thing where everyone's registered for a gun and it's put in a mass database. The NRA would go more ape stuff than they do now. So that's just thing to think about. And then I just end it with, would it have mattered if the FBI had followed up? What could have been done? And it still goes to that gap that I talked about last week. He's done something, whether he's threaten the stuff on YouTube, or someone thinks he's weird based on a police hotline, but he still didn't do anything arrestable or to put him in a psychiatric restriction. And there's that gap. And I don't think in this issue that he would have, if you even had the FBI follow up or law enforcement follow up, that there's, he still would have been able to purchase an assault weapon. He still would have been gone to the school, and he didn't commit a crime until he opened fire on that school. And I don't think it would have mattered even if the FBI had followed up and connected the proverbial dots. So, food for thought. Please debate me on these issues in these discussion boards, and I will put out a YouTube later on this weekend. And we might get more details on this, but I'll put a YouTube out this weekend as part of our weekly session.